Good afternoon. I'm Warwick Sabin, Executive Director of the Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF Digital Discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being a part of the Society of Fellows. And of course, the current pandemic has upended our economy in nearly every sector, but we have seen particularly notable impacts in energy due to reduced consumption, changing habits, major adjustments in production, capacity, and storage, the ongoing evolution of the industry, and many other factors. And of course, these dynamics can profoundly influence geopolitics and international stability. So we're honored to have Fareed Zakaria and Meghan O'Sullivan in conversation today to discuss these trends in depth. Fareed hosts Fareed Zakaria GPS for CNN Worldwide and is a columnist for the Washington Post, a contributing editor for The Atlantic, and the author of 3 New York Times bestselling books, In Defense of Liberal Education, The Post-American World, and the Future of Freedom. He serves on the boards of the Council on Foreign Relations and New America, and prior to his tenure at CNN Worldwide, Fareed was editor of Newsweek International, managing editor of Foreign Affairs, and a columnist for Time. In 2017, he was awarded the Arthur Ross Media Award by the American Academy of Diplomacy. He was named a top 10 global thinker of the last 10 years by Foreign Policy magazine in 2019, and Esquire once called him the most influential foreign policy advisor of his generation. And Meghan is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and Director of the Geopolitics of Energy Project at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. She is also the chair of the North American group of the Trilateral Commission. She is an award-winning author, and in 2017, she published her 3rd book, Windfall: How the New Energy Abundance Upends Global Politics and Strengthens America's Power. She serves on the boards of Raytheon Technologies and the Council on Foreign Relations, and she was awarded the Defense Department's highest honor for civilians and 3 times the State Department's Superior Honor Award. And as with all of our SOF digital discussions, Fareed and Meghan will be glad to answer your questions after the initial conversation, and you could submit your questions anytime by simply clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. And if you encounter any problems at all during the event, please email the SOF hotline and our team will be glad to assist you. So Fareed and Meghan will be in conversation for the first 20 or 30 minutes, and then I will pose your questions to them for the rest of the event. And now, Fareed, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Warwick, and thank you for that very generous introduction. You did not mention among my many glittering accomplishments is that I was once your boss. Something that I treasure and was delighted to be able to do. Warwick was my intern many years ago. So it's a huge pleasure to do this, and it's a particular honor to do it with Meghan, who is a friend and a colleague, and is really the person who I think today studies the world of energy, particularly from a political and economic perspective, better than anyone I know of. So this is going to be a treat. And I want to start out, Meghan, by asking you, what do you think? Paint the picture for us. We know this shock that COVID has caused around the world. We know that for the most part, economies are in a near depression-like state. Forget about the stock market, which is anticipating a future recovery. How accurately we can discuss later. But the actual employment numbers, output numbers are all at levels way below the 2008-2009 levels. Government funding is off. So example, New York tax revenues are down 3 times worse than they were in 2008. What does the world of energy look like? Has it been able to anticipate the future in the same way, or is it still deeply depressed? Paint a kind of picture for us.
Sure, happy to do that. Let me first say that it's a pleasure to be with the Aspen Society of Fellows. I wish we were in Aspen doing this. And Fareed, it's great fun to be here with you. You and your column and your show, you've been a voice of reason and a source of great ideas, especially in these last 6 months. So I'm really pleased to be able to chat with you and the Society of Fellows today. So you asked me to paint a picture of the energy world. I would say that, especially when you compare it to the larger economy at whole, the picture is even more uncertain and even more dire. I'd say it's really hard to overemphasize the disruption that has happened in energy markets in the last 6 months. I'll just give you a couple of numbers. So the International Energy Agency expects that global energy demand is going to drop by 6% for the entire course of 2020. And that, to put that in perspective, that's 7 times the drop in energy demand that happened after the 2008 crisis. And I'll give you this this anecdote for you particularly, it is the equivalent of India's energy demand just dropping off the face of the planet. It's a massive decrease in energy demand. And as you suggested, oil's been the one that's been the hardest hit. If you think about it, oil is really the energy source that moves the global economy. More than 65% or so of oil is used in some form of transportation. And if you immobilize, 4 billion people, this is going to lead to a historic drop in demand. And that's exactly what happened. Demand in the second quarter dropped by 20%. This led to a cratering of prices. We even saw negative oil prices in the United States for a short period, which we had never seen before. This has also affected other energy sources. Fossil fuels have all been negatively affected. Renewables is the one bright spot. But I would say as we look to the future, there's a lot of uncertainty about what comes next for the energy industry and the oil industry in particular. I would say that with every big disruption we've seen in this industry, things never go back to the way they were before. And there were already big questions around demand for oil for the future, around the energy transition and how it was going to affect different energy sectors. And I think this crisis around COVID has really sharpened those questions and really added to the uncertainty that existed, in February of this year before the whole COVID thing broke free.
So let's dig down a little bit in terms of like what potential rebound you might see, because the prices are back in a way. They've certainly moved up from their kind of drastic lows, and there are a number of countries that are hopeful that they'll stay buoyant. And the argument, I suppose, is, this is particularly with regard to oil, the argument is, look, a lot of transport will continue, cars, ships. Yeah, there won't be as many people flying planes. Do you think that that's a reasonable projection for for 2021, for example? Or do you think that it's more likely this is all just going to look very subdued and depressed for a while?
Well, as you suggest, there's a lot of different views on this about how quickly demand is going to come back. And a lot of it does revolve around air travel and when people are going to start to travel like they did before. I would say that we are going to see demand coming back. And we've already started to see that in other parts of the world. You mentioned that the oil price has come back. It's come back to the low 40s, mid 40s, which I think most people wouldn't have predicted even just a few months ago. Yeah. However, we need to look at why it's come back. Partially, it is demand that has been rising, but it's also because there have been massive cutbacks in supply. And so I think that has been the big driver of increasing the price, because we did see a historic deal, not just among OPEC members, but also OPEC's wider circle of affiliated countries called OPEC Plus, as well as cutbacks in places like Norway and Brazil, and even market-induced dramatic cutbacks in the United States from about 13 million barrels of oil a day to about 10. So you add this all up and you have the world suddenly stopping producing about almost 17% of what it was producing before. And that is really the big driver behind the big increase in price. So the question is, how long will that supply stay subdued, and how quickly will that demand come back? Now, the best way to guess about demand, I think, is to look at China, because China's economy is probably the first out of the blocks to recover from the COVID crisis. And it looks like their energy demand in most transportation sectors are coming back, except for international travel. So again, I think we can expect an increase in demand, and that is going to be helpful. But I'm of the mind that those who think we're going to function demand and for oil over the coming years are probably being overly optimistic, and that this is a moment in which we need to think really hard about the energy transition and what in fact are we going to do from the perspective of oil producing countries if the world has come close to what is called peak oil demand. Maybe the world will never consume more than 100 million barrels of oil a day, which it was doing at the beginning of this year. And if so, what does it mean for all of these countries whose livelihoods and financial viability rest so squarely on energy, oil, and reasonably priced oil at that?
So it's fascinating to have you unpack that oil price at the low 40s and to recognize that that's largely because of the decline in supply. A cutback in supply. It reminds me of that old saying that OPEC is like a tea bag. It only works when it's in really hot water. In other words, when things get tough, OPEC, works as a cartel. People stop cheating, they stop defecting. And that's, one of the primary engines here. But as you say, at some point, these countries that are losing oil revenue because, cutting back on supply, it keeps the price up, but overall they have much less money coming in than they did. Will they start cheating? And will that start the cycle that usually happens?
Right. And actually, we didn't mention it, but it's worth saying a word about. Exacerbating this decrease in demand was basically a tiff between Saudi Arabia and Russia in March, where Russia first and then Saudi Arabia decided they were going to flood the market. So initially there's this huge boost in supply, and this led to this major crisis, and then this pullback, the tea bag in hot water. And this time OPEC, pulled together in a way that we've really never seen before. You even have a country like Iraq, which is in dire financial straits, cutting back on its oil production in order to meet its obligations to OPEC. This is an extraordinary level of compliance. And I do think you would be very optimistic to think it's going to hold indefinitely, especially for the Biden administration that comes in and rejoins the Iran deal, the JCPOA, and more Iranian oil comes on the market. This could blow the whole thing wide open again. And that's one thing I think analysts are cognizant of, that we're in a little bit of an artificial moment. Even though OPEC has started to ease some of those restrictions, it still has pretty strong ones in place.
So one of the things that you have written about and that others have as well is that probably the single most important geopolitical shift that has taken place in the world of energy in the last 10 years has been the rise of the United States. The United States has become close to the single largest producer of liquid hydrocarbons in the world and the single largest exporter of liquid hydrocarbons in the world. Obviously, it goes up and down a little, but that has meant there's a sense that it has less dependence on Saudi Arabia, it has less dependence on the Middle East. It's unearthed this kind of extraordinary world of fracking, and with all the complexities that means. What has COVID done to that particular thing, to America's position in the world of energy?
Sure, it's a great question. A few elements to it. First of all, I would say the U.S. has emerged. It's probably right now a little bit more neck and neck given the declines. But up until very recently, the U.S. was the largest producer of oil and the largest producer of natural gas in the world. And this was, as you said, due to the whole fracking phenomenon. I do think that American politicians and the Trump administration in particular has sort of oversold that to the United States. I think there are huge geopolitical benefits to that and to the United States and America's allies. But I do think this idea that suddenly it frees us from being dependent on the Middle East was always a little bit of a pipe dream, because we're very tied to the global market. And so even though we're not importing a lot of oil from the Middle East, if there's a disruption in the Middle East, that disrupts the whole global market, and we're part of it. So I think even before COVID, the Trump administration calls U.S. energy dominance, I think was overstated, overplayed. But now with COVID, I think it's going to be still significant, but a little bit more muted. And what I mean by that is the United States, as I mentioned, has pulled back on its production in a pretty significant way, down from 13 million barrels of oil a day to 10 million barrels of oil a day, which is significant, but it still leaves the United States as one of, if not the largest producer of oil in the world. Right now, the largest producer, because Saudi Arabia and Russia are artificially cutting back on their production. So the US is still going to be a dominant energy player. And what really matters, what has really been to the US geopolitical benefit, is this major swing in the global energy situation to energy abundance. So if you and I were having this conversation 10 years ago, we'd be talking about running out of oil and scarcity and all of that. That conversation has totally shifted. Those ideas are kind of Mad Max ideas. They're things of Hollywood. We're now in a world of global energy abundance. And I think even the COVID decrease in supply on the US side doesn't take away from the fact that the world is going to be in a position of energy abundance.
What about, one sub question, what about fracking in particular and natural gas? What happens to America there?
Well, I think, okay, that is a totally different question. If, let's just say hypothetically, this is not part of Biden's policy platform right now, but if the US policy banning fracking, then the United States would be in a totally different energy situation. I mean, I cannot state that more strongly. But basically, I'm just roughly speaking, of the 10 million barrels of oil a day that the US is producing, about 7 or 8 million are from fracking. So if we suddenly ban fracking, and in natural gas, it's a similar ratio. We would suddenly, literally in a very short period of time, go to being heavily dependent on imports of natural gas and, well, more particularly of oil. And that would suddenly create all kinds of national security concerns that were very dominant in the middle of the last decade.
I meant it a different way, Meghan, which is, what about with the price so low, can fracking, particularly of natural gas, survive, or will, as you know, one of the reasons the Saudis and the Russians were pumping all that oil into the market in the first place was to kill American fracking. They figured if they can get the cost low enough, it's still profitable for them to pump oil, but it would put all the American frackers out of business.
Okay, great. Sorry, I misunderstood. Certainly it is the case that there is a price at which fracking or production of any oil doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why you saw such a rapid shut-in of American production that was not mandated by our government. It was simply companies saying it doesn't make sense for us to produce when the price is negative or even when the price is low. So there will be fields that won't be developed when the price is low because it won't be economical. The key thing, however, is the price at which it is still economical to produce oil by fracking or other measures, but particularly fracking, has dropped pretty dramatically. So when the Saudis first started playing around with this idea of driving fracking out of business in 2014, they thought they just needed to get the price of oil below $80. It turns out that Americans were very innovative, and they cut costs, and technology made it easier and cheaper to produce oil. And that's still going on, although there is a point at which, costs cannot come down anymore. I actually think, at $45, there's still a lot of resource that doesn't feel economical to produce. But even a little higher, at 50, or certainly at 55, you have a lot of producers that will be eager to go back online and start producing. So we're kind of in that gray zone right now. And obviously not every field in the US has the same economics associated with it. But I would say that I don't expect this current price environment to stop fracking. I just think it will decrease the amount of fracking just by taking the less efficient wells offline, which is what we've seen in the last few months.
Okay, so now give us a sense of the geopolitics of all this, because it seems to me that if you're at $40 a barrel oil, you are in a situation where there are countries like Saudi Arabia where the cost of production is so low that they're fine. They're certainly going to take a hit, but you tell me. I mean, they're clearly going to have to spend from their foreign exchange reserves in order to meet their domestic obligations to a very large welfare state. The tiny countries that have huge amounts of oil, like the UAE and Kuwait, will be fine. But the places that always get into trouble are the ones that have lots of people, and therefore, but the expenditures are large. Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, Russia. So tell us, first of all, if I'm right, and give us paint a picture of like who is the most vulnerable. If you were to have to short a stock, as it were, of a country, what are you looking at very worried?
Sure. And first, I would say you're correct. I would agree with you. The one thing I would say is I'm a little less sanguine on Saudi Arabia, because you're correct that certainly they have the lowest cost production in the world. But another number that we have to look at is what we call the fiscal break-even price. And it's basically like what they need to get per barrel in order to meet their budget and their commitments to their citizens. And they brought that down a lot in the last few years, but it still rests around $80 a barrel. So they're still dramatically in the hole when it comes to the amount of money. And this is problematic for the Saudis because they had really counted on, more years of being able to take excess oil money and put it into refashioning their economy to make it a different kind of economy, so that when oil really ran out of steam in the global economy, they were well positioned. So I'm worried about Saudi Arabia for that reason, not in the immediate short term, but I'm worried about their ability to enact these reforms that are essential to them actually being a viable economy and a stable country. But to ask for your shorting list, I would say there are certainly countries in the Middle East, and I regret to say that Iraq is on the top of that list, I would say. In part because so much of their budget goes to just paying their civil servants. And the price of oil has come down so dramatically that they're struggling to do even that. And so a country that needs enormous investment in rebuilding, in security services, in all kinds of things, doesn't even have enough money to pay their civil servants. They've started paying people instead of every month, every 45 days. And this is going to be tough for them to come out of. But a lot of the countries that are in the worst situation are not necessarily in the Middle East. Ecuador is another country that's really having a hard time. Nigeria was struggling to come out of an economic depression even before this, before their revenues were slashed. So we have countries really across the globe that are challenged by this low oil price and are basically just trying to make ends meet in the hope that something changes that will drive the oil price higher. Now, if we were having this conversation among oil industry executives and big producers from different oil producing countries, we would be talking a lot about, there might be a price spike in the coming years because investment has dried up. That means supply isn't coming online. And if demand comes back robustly, then we're going to have a price spike. And, some of them may be hoping for that. I probably would be if I were in their situation. It's not a crazy scenario, but it's certainly not a scenario on which I would bank the viability of my country.
And what about Russia? It seems to me, and Putin has done something very interesting, which I think puts Russia in a good position, which is he has essentially deglobalized the Russian economy and stabilized it. Deglobalized by really not relying that much on the West and on the larger economy, particularly for financing, and stabilized it by having a very large foreign exchange reserve pile. So it's sort of like downside protection. He's not getting a lot in growth, but it means that I think that he lives in fear of the 1998 Russian default, which really cratered the Russian economy. And so they, ironically, are likely to go through this in better shape than one might have imagined. Would you agree?
I think you're exactly right that Putin and just the nature of the Russian economy is such that it has been better able to weather some of these lower oil prices. And actually, that was what was behind way back in March when Russia decided to pull out of the OPEC deal that began this supply surge that contributed in conjunction with the demand drop to the crazy low oil prices. Russia made an estimate, which turned out to be wrong, that it could survive low oil prices for longer. It probably could have in the absence of COVID.
Right.
No one at the time, people were talking about, we need to cut back 1.5 million barrels of oil a day, not 20 million, which is what actually happened. So the Russians were right in the sense that they were better positioned than many other oil producers to weather lower oil prices. in part, their budget, I think their budget is set something like they need a fiscal break even, not like Saudi Arabia of over 80, but more like 47. So they have that. They also have the fact that the ruble has devalued a lot, and that hasn't had such a huge impact on their consumers because, as you said, they've done a lot of import substitution, a lot of self-sufficiency measures, but it does mean they still get dollars for their oil, and that translates into more rubles, and so it has been more sustainable for the Russians than others. That said, the dramatic nature of what we're talking about and the dramatic, unpredictable impact on the oil market has meant that the Russian economy wasn't really expected to grow a great deal this year, but now it is expected to contract. And I think it does make it harder for Putin, who had basically been promising that he was going to invest more in social security measures, more social well-being, education, and health for Russian people that really were looking for some kind of increase in their standard of living. I think it's going to be harder to do in this oil environment, although I don't think this is an existential problem for Russia as it is for some other countries.
That's a really fascinating overview. I hope everyone can see why I think you're the best. You're the best at this in the world. Warwick, you want to take us on through some questions from the Society Fellows?
Yeah, very happy to. And thank you, by the way, for the robust conversation from both of you. And as I pose these questions, either and both of you should feel free to address them. But we certainly have a few that have accumulated here, so I'll get right to it. Arthur Silbergeld asks, will the major oil production companies be pursuing leases in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge in this environment? And is it wise to destroy this fragile environment when movement is away from oil in numerous means of transportation?
I'll let Meghan take that.
Sure, but Fareed, please jump in. I hope we'll get some China questions and other things as well, which will allow me to pivot to you a bit. So as obviously our questioner knows and others might know, the Trump administration just within the last couple of days announced that it was going to open up this Arctic reserve for the exploration for oil. This is something that has been highly controversial, debated for a long period of time. It does strike me as a very odd time to make this declaration, in part because there are many parts of the United States that are probably going to be much easier to explore, extract, and importantly, transport oil than the Arctic for sure. And so I don't think we're going to see a rush of big companies or small companies for sure, but not big companies to the Arctic to try to do exploration when oil prices are so low. There's plenty of acreage in the lower 48 states. The Permian Basin is a massive, massive resource right there in Texas and New Mexico. And you keep in mind that companies like Shell that invested billions of dollars in trying to develop Arctic resources had huge problems and ultimately abandoned those efforts. And that was in a much higher price environment. So I feel like this is a more of a political statement, more of an aggressive move on the part of the Trump administration, just to demonstrate to the Trump administration supporters where this administration intends to continue to take the country if the president is reelected, and that is towards the maximum development of oil and gas resources in the United States possible.
Yeah, I would just add one thing, which is just remember Meghan's point, which is oil production has been cut 20 million barrels. So for every company, they have these huge fixed investments that they've made. The first thing they're going to do is get back up to that, recover those 20 million barrels before they go searching for new places.
Definitely.
And I'll tell you, I'll give you a preview. So a lot of these questions are trying to move us past just talking about oil. So I'm going to sort of kind of run through them. The next one is from Judith Barnard. She's wondering why there hasn't been a mention of solar, wind, switchgrass, retrofitting office buildings. She asks, is there really no place in the discussion for those forms of power and energy saving?
Well, I would begin just by saying, look, there's been a huge growth in all those areas, but it is worth pointing out, the world's energy consumption today is about 80% fossil fuels. In 1985, it was about 80% fossil fuels. So there, don't be if you're looking at this seriously from the point of view of energy, sustainability, and renewal, don't mask the reality, which is while in the advanced industrial world, there have been some significant progress. It's, you have to keep in mind, China, India, places in Africa, their energy demand grows almost entirely with fossil fuel. And again, that's changing, but it hasn't changed so much that you can get around it in the short term. That would be my 2 cents.
Sure, and I would agree with that, Fareed, but I will add that there certainly is a lot to discuss on that front. And as I mentioned, and I'll say a little bit more about, but happy to delve into it in any level of detail that people would like, that of the uncertainties that have been unearthed by this crisis with COVID are big questions around the energy transition. So as everyone is well aware, we are well into this transition to a more sustainable global energy mix. Although as Fareed points out, actually the advances made in renewable energy, which have been significant, have been enough to meet rising energy demand, but not enough to displace fossil fuels, which is what we really need it to do. We really need renewable and really other alternative sources, including nuclear and other forms of energy, to grow fast enough to displace fossil fuels. That's what we need to do to start making the progress we want. But just on the energy transition, I think there are some optimistic things that have happened and some pessimistic things. On the optimistic side, and this is the subject for a whole, a whole discussion in itself, is that we have this new impetus, this new openness to governments spending enormous amounts of money in order to revive economies. This is particularly true in the developed world. And Fareed has written about how, people are no longer obsessed with this question of how big government should be or how small government should be. They just want government to be effective. So we see this huge increase in government willingness to spend money. And in some parts of the world, you actually have governments that are saying, we're going to spend this money, and our objective is going to be not just to revive the economy, but to do so in a way that advances our climate goals and advances the energy transition. We've actually seen ministers from all over the world talk about this, but Europe is the place where we've actually seen action. Literally on July 21st, you had the longest, or one of the longest ever summits of European leaders. And the net result was a pretty striking recovery package in which a huge proportion of the billions of dollars that were pledged were explicitly to go to climate-friendly initiatives, climate-friendly investments, and climate-friendly spending. And there was also a provision, which we haven't even talked about in the United States, forget about past, a provision saying nothing in this Recovery Act should be against climate-friendly things, meaning none of this money should be used to advance coal or other dirty fuels. And this stimulus package in Europe was not just more spending, it was also talking about policies, because we can be excited about stimulus spending being dedicated to climate-friendly investments, and that's important, but we shouldn't fool ourselves to think that in itself is going to be enough to advance the energy transition. We need policies that can shape the behavior of non-government actors, of the private sector, of foundations and universities and individuals. So I think there is, there's also reasons for pessimism, which I can go into, and they have to do with the US-China relationship, but I think there is reasons to think that actually one of the silver linings coming out of this COVID crisis could be that when governments act, they act with the objective to try to advance our climate goals in a more aggressive way than we could have imagined even 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, and since you brought it up, why don't we, address the issue of China, and Fareed, perhaps you can take that on, because, again, you brought it up earlier, Meghan, and I think it's an important, angle here to address at this time.
Sure. I mean, I can talk, make just a few remarks in general, and then hand it over to Meghan to maybe do more on the energy side. I think that China is, without any question, coming out of the post-COVID world, or the COVID world, in better shape than mostly anybody else. Partly that is because they really crushed the virus. They handled it, they mismanaged it at first. I think lied might be a strong word, but there was a certain amount of deception involved. Though it's fair to say that mostly every country that is ground zero for one of these viruses tends to handle it badly at the beginning, partly because they don't know what they're dealing with. But the Chinese one went beyond that. It did involve some cover-up, but the response was brutal and effective. And I'm not sure you needed to be as brutal as they were. At one point, they locked down essentially 750 million people. But it has worked. So life is back to normal almost. Most importantly, industrial production in China is back to 95%. The economy is returning to something like 75-80% in general. It's in the midst of a larger transition, which is taking place in China, which is a movement away from being entirely dependent on exports and much more concerned with its domestic consumption. You're seeing domestic consumption rise. So to give you a statistic that might startle you, 17% of the Chinese economy is right now, of Chinese GDP, is exports. That's down from 85% 20 years ago. Again, interesting comparison, 50% of the German economy, 45% is exports. So China has managed to take advantage of its huge domestic market. And you can see that in companies like Alibaba and Tencent and all that kind of activity. Now, that transition involves a much larger role for the state. So what Meghan was saying earlier applies to China. China might be the forerunner of this process, where people are very comfortable with the big state. The state has lots of state-owned enterprises, but there is also a very large, vibrant private sector. I think Americans find this very difficult to understand because they assume that, there is a linear path here, and that, of course, what's going to happen is China is going to get more and more private sector oriented. The private sector will grow, displace the public sector, then that'll lead to a larger middle class. The middle class will ask for more rights, and eventually you'll get a liberal democratic capitalist society. That is not the path China is on. China is on a path that mixes together a large role for the state and a large role for the private sector. Both very confident, both unlikely to be displaced. And that is the future we're going to deal with. So a very dynamic China, very advanced. There are many people, including Bill Gates and Eric Schmidt, who argue China is already ahead of the United States in artificial intelligence. It's not a question of will they catch up with us. It's a question of will we catch up with them. We have a few shiny baubles like AlphaGo where we're ahead, but in a broader sense, in terms of quantum computing and machine learning, they are probably ahead. Of the 500 fastest computers in the world, about 300 are in China. So that's the kind of picture of China that I think is the reality. It's not invulnerable. It has huge demographic challenges it has to deal with. This transition it's trying to make is very complicated. But, there are challenges in the West as well that has gone through secular stagnation for the last 20 years. I think it means that we are in essentially a new bipolar world. We are in a world where, if you remember when Hans Morgenthau, the foreign policy theorist, described the world as bipolar in 1946, 47, I think it was, his point was, it's not that the Soviet Union is equal to the United States, is that the two of them are miles ahead of everybody else because Britain had collapsed as a great power by 1945. So if you look at the Chinese economy, it is not just the second largest economy in the world, it's it's larger than the next four economies put together. The Chinese military today is larger than the next four militaries put together. So we're in a new world. It's a bipolar one, and that is the reality that kind of your generation will have to confront.
Great. And if I could add to that a little bit on the energy front. First, I think, Fareed, that was a really excellent painting of, hey, this is the China we're facing. And I really recommend to the people watching today your foreign affairs piece at the beginning of the year, where you make the case for let's not abandon trying to engage China before we truly evaluate, what's at stake and what our adversary looks like. And what the gains of the past 40 years have been. Just a few words to supplement what you said, Fareed, on the energy side. I'd say about a year or two ago, there was this real sense that China was emerging as the renewable energy leader, and this was going to be a great source of economic power for China and geopolitical power. I think that's still a possibility, but there are some question marks around it, in large part having to do with the economic situation, with the COVID environment, but even just the US trade war, which really did have a more adverse impact on China's economy than it did on the US economy. So what we saw is before, the last year or so, China was far and away making the largest investments in renewable energy than any country in the world, basically the US and Europe put together. And China had very aggressive goals and a track record of meeting those goals to try to do things like in electric vehicles and new energy infrastructure and all of that. So China was really, and then China, of course, absorbed the leadership role when the United States declared it was going to exit the Paris Agreement. I would say in the last year or so, particularly in the last 6 months, there are more question marks about whether China is positioned to maintain that, that leadership role, in part because if you look at its stimulus, unlike Europe, as I discussed, its stimulus does devote a lot of money. There's about $500 billion in basic bonds for local governments to make investments, some of which are in renewable energy, but there's also hundreds of billions of dollars for dirty industries. And the Chinese have put down, basically permitted 10 gigawatts of coal power plants since the pandemic's begun. So essentially the Chinese seem to be taking an approach. We still care about the energy transition. We still care about renewable energy. We still think it's a good investment, but we're more concerned about energy security, economic growth, and political stability. And we're not going to put climate goals ahead of these other goals. So if we can satisfy those objectives and be climate friendly, great. But otherwise, we're going to make sure that the economy grows enough that we can kind of keep political dissatisfaction at bay. So I think, again, I'll just end by saying China's head start in this department, I think, is a little bit in question, and that creates an opportunity for the United States, if it chooses to take it, to regain its leadership role in climate and in energy, which would require a big departure from the current policy trajectory we're on and the level of international engagement on these issues. But I think the opportunity is there for the taking. And incidentally, it could be part of a more comprehensive strategy vis-a-vis China to really hone in on build up America's competitiveness in a range of technologies, but particularly in technologies related to climate and energy.
So perfect way to end. If you are willing to spend another couple minutes, I'm going to try to wrap 3 questions that we've received into one. Miles Krieger had asked, what's the latest news in battery development? Shelley had asked for you to comment on the rolling blackouts in California, but then Peter Rigby kind of combined those two in a nice question. He says, it's a transitional problem, but the West Coast heat wave has highlighted the limitations of renewable sourced electricity, including the reliance on batteries. So what lessons do you think we might take from this? And I think it's a perfect jumping off point when you talk about American competitiveness and how we adopt and adapt to these new technologies.
Look, it seems to me the most important thing to bear in mind is the only way that this is going to work in the long run is if we can find a renewable energy. We need to find energy that is cheaper than coal and has close to zero carbon emissions. Because if you cannot find energy that is cheaper than coal, whatever we do becomes irrelevant. Because Meghan just described what the Chinese are doing. The Indians are doing exactly the same thing. And you have to understand why these countries do this. Once they face crises, once they face difficulties, they say, look, we have all this coal. We can, it's the cheapest form of energy in the world. It gives us enormous self-reliance. We don't have to worry about the Middle East. So that's where you're going to go. So the American energy revolution needs to be a real breakthrough. It can't just be incremental shifts. And so my own view has always been, we are way underfunding the kind of breakthrough element of this. And we are doing a little too much. I'm not sure we're doing too much. Let me put it this way. We're doing too little on things like fusion, on the kind of, bolt from the blue ideas. Some of that is going on in battery, which unfortunately, increases in capacity by about 10%, 10 to 15% a year. But what you need is another breakthrough. If you took all the batteries in the world and strung them together, this is Bill Gates's calculation, it would keep the lights on in the world. It would keep world energy going for 10 minutes. So it gives you, again, a sense of the scale of the problem, because unless you have batteries that can store at a whole different level, obviously you have a problem with wind and with solar, because you need some place to be able to store them. So it feels to me like all of this says we should have a carbon tax, and we should take a good chunk of that money, and we should be funding real breakthrough technologies so that we get to the point where we have something that is cheaper than coal and has almost no emissions. That will then transform the world.
Great. I think that's a fantastic response to those questions. I'll just add two things briefly. One, I would say what Fareed just said underscores the reality that renewables on their own aren't going to be enough, that actually other sources of alternative energy are going to be important as well. And so it was interesting looking at Biden's $2 trillion plan for climate, that unlike Bernie Sanders, Biden still left a place for nuclear energy, which I think is very vital if we're going to be realistic about our ability to meet carbon neutral goals. So there's also a place for technologies that will take carbon out of the air, so that you could still use natural gas, but that it could be a net carbon zero energy source. So I think, again, there are technologies that were kind of dismissed for some time, but now have come back, and people have said we really need these technologies, whether they're new forms of smaller cell nuclear power or carbon capture, or something that's getting a lot of attention in other parts of the world is the hydrogen economy. There can be a carbon zero type of green hydrogen, and I think a lot of people expect that could play a role, not immediately, but in the future. And that, as Fareed pointed out, will require a lot of investment in R&D, and something that would be well worth our time. The last thing I would note, and I know we're over, was, Fareed, you make the good point. We need things that are cheaper than coal, but then you also mentioned we need a carbon tax. And I would say that, one way of getting things cheaper than coal is actually to price in the externality associated with the use of coal. So basically raise the price of coal. Again, in reading candidate Vice President Biden's plan, or candidate president, former Vice President Biden's plan, that was notably absent on this. And I think it's the most efficient way for us to allocate resources, and to do so in a way to incentivize a wide range of actors in our society to make investments that will further our energy transition. So I think those are just some of the things that we're going to need to see, in addition to talk about solar and wind, which I fully support, but they're going to be part of the solution and not the entirety of it.
Well, certainly a tremendous subject to try to tackle. We did as much as we possibly could, I think, at the time allotted. And I want to thank both of you for giving us your time, and especially for doing it digitally. We hope next time, Meghan, as you said, we'll be able to see you in Aspen, both of you. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing all of these insights with us.
Great.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to our members, thank you for being with us again for this digital discussion. We'll be joining you again soon, but in the meantime, enjoy this end of summer respite as we head into Labor Day. We expect a pretty vigorous and exciting fall, but of course, everybody should enjoy the time with their family and their friends and those who you can safely be with at this time. So stay healthy, stay safe until next time, and thank you for being a member of the Society of Fellows. Good day.